Hey you guys, and welcome back. So I wanted to do this video because I keep hearing this narrative from two particular groups of people, right? And of course I'm talking about black men and white women who keep putting out this narrative about the evil white man. Okay. Now before I get into the video and I read you this article pertaining to white women, some of the things that have been done in the past, and also to support the message that I had put out years ago that you can't have a racist, evil white man who is raised in a non-racist, non-evil household. He has to have been raised by a white mother who enforced and instilled that in him, because women are the first teachers of the children. And so what I'm going to read you today is going to reinforce that from a historical standpoint. So before I get into that, I just want to make this quick note. Okay, because I keep hearing this narrative coming from white women. I'm guessing speaking to people who don't know any better, or who are maybe a little bit naive or gullible, that they are saying that they are dating black men because white men don't like overweight or fat women. Okay, they are more than likely saying that because it's more to the story than that, because I'm going to tell you, I am born and raised in the South, and I see white men marrying fat white women all day, every day, and twice on Sunday. So that is just something that they're putting out there to try to pull the wool over your eyes as to, why they're getting with black men. But that is just simply not true. That is true that many white men prefer their women to look like little pre-adolescent boys with long hair and makeup. That is true. There are many of them who like their women to look like that, but that is not true of all white men, or even the majority of white men. So you see this everywhere, to where white men are getting married to overweight, plump, fluffy white women all day, every day, and twice on Sundays. There were plenty of, thick, not necessarily fat, but, fluffy, plump white girls that I went to high school with, or, went to school with, and they kept a boyfriend. It wasn't that the boys had an issue with dating non-skinny white girls. It was other issues involved, their personality, their attitude. One of them's parent didn't like the other one, and so that caused issue on the relationship, and they ended up breaking up because of that. So this idea that white men, white guys just are adverse to non-skinny white women is just a lie. Now, this is an article about an interview with the author of a book, Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. And many of you have heard of this book, and some of you may even own the book. And if you don't own the book, I would highly suggest that you purchase it. But this is going to be the interview where the author talks about the inspiration for why she wrote her book titled "They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South." So it says, in her new book, They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, UC Berkeley Associate Professor of History, expands our understanding of American slavery and the 19th century slave market with an investigation into the role of white women in the slave economy. She found they were active participants, profited from it, and were as brutal as men in their management techniques. What led you to research white women slaveholders? While in graduate school, I stumbled upon a rather notorious slave-owning woman from New Orleans, Marie LaLaurie. She was well known because she became the subject of a scandal when local members of her community discovered she was torturing and had even murdered some of the slaves she owned. She was married and the mother of 2 daughters at the time of the discovery. What I found remarkable was not her violence, but what was clearly a deep economic investment in slavery and the extraordinary level of control she exercised over the enslaved people in her household. She was the only slave owner in the household, and as a consequence, she was the only person who exercised control over them. I wanted to know whether there were other women like her, that is, white married women who also held legal title to enslaved people and who exercised control over them. This led me on the research journey that led to my dissertation, which formed the basis for my book, They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Initially, I sought out these women where other women's historians had looked, their letters and diaries, but I found that they rarely discussed their economic investments in slavery. This compelled me to look elsewhere, and I examined the records which scholars of the African American experience look to when they study the lives of the enslaved, testimonies of enslaved and formerly enslaved people, and a collection of interviews which the federal government conducted with formerly enslaved people in the 1930s and 1940s. I was astonished to discover just how frequently formerly enslaved people identified married, slave-owning women who owned them or others, and how they talked about the deep economic investment these white women had in the institution of slavery. Taking my cue from formerly enslaved people and using some of the details they provided in their interviews, I ventured into other archives, financial, legal, military records, newspapers, and letters and personal correspondence to tell the story that unfolds in my book. Who was the typical white woman slaveholder, and how did she come to acquire slaves? The typical female slave owner claimed legal title to 10 enslaved people or less. Far more often, she owned less than 5. And this holds for the average male slave owner as well. Much of the scholarship about white women in slavery tends to examine their relationships to enslaved people in adulthood. But my book starts the story far earlier when these women were young girls and infants. By doing so, I was able to show that white girls often received enslaved people as gifts. Some were only infants when they were given enslaved people as their own. While many of these girls and women inherited enslaved people from loved ones throughout their lives, not just when a family member died, they also brought them from slave markets throughout the South. Was this a common practice in the South? It was quite common for girls and women to own enslaved people. Now, I wanted to stop here and make a point, because there's a part of the Bible in the curses where it talks about the curses, and this is for those people who are either familiar with or who believe according to the core beliefs of the Hebrew Israelites, which is that black people in America are the descendants of Jacob. There's a part of the Bible that talks about where women and children will rule over us. And of course, because many of the men in our community, regardless of what their religious affiliation, whether they're Hebrew Israelite or Christian or atheist or devil worshiper or Nation of Islam, many of them seem to be experiencing a spiritual crisis, right? And so the men who believe according to the beliefs of the Hebrew Israelites use this scripture to point to black women as the ones who are ruling over black men. They never put two and two together and realize that white women and white children own slaves as well. This is something that I knew and understood before this book came out, but this just broke it down so beautifully about the role that white women had in the slave owning process. And so because the men in our community have such a disdain for the women who are their mirror image, regardless of whether they're American, African, Caribbean, you see this kind of mindset amongst them. And so for it to be so, this kind of mindset to be so widespread throughout a whole race of men, this has to be some sort of spiritual crisis that is happening amongst the men. Oh, this is wrong. You don't have any racial integrity because you are a black woman with a white man, but instead of showing a black woman and white man, they should have black men and white women up there. You really don't even have to know what their religious affiliation is or where they're from, because this is so widespread that it really doesn't matter. It just crosses boundaries, it crosses nations, it crosses religious affiliations, it crosses everything. It was quite common for girls and women to own enslaved people. The question of just how many women and girls own enslaved people is a complicated one to answer for several reasons, but I am completing a quantitative project that I hope will bring us closer to an answer. Some of my preliminary data show that white women constituted approximately 40% of all the slave owners in my data sets. This is a figure that also holds in data collected by Catherine Hall at the University College London. She and a team of researchers created a database using British parliamentary records related to abolition and slave owner compensation, and they also found that women constituted 40% of the slave owners who sought compensation after Britain abolished slavery in its colonies and territories. What were the advantages for women of owning slaves? In my book, I focus primarily on married slave-owning women rather than single and widowed women. Prevailing scholarship contended that married women rarely possessed control over property because of a legal doctrine called coverture. Under coverture, when any property-owning or wage-earning woman married, all of her property and wages immediately became her husband's, and he could do whatever he wanted with them. Scholars have looked at this doctrine and, for the most part, argued that these women did not have economic investments in slavery because, by law, their slaves would become their husbands upon marriage. This was clearly true for some women, but not all of them. In the book, I show the ways that these married women circumvented the disabilities that came with marriage, particularly as those impairments pertain to property ownership. Slave ownership allowed these women to exercise certain kinds of power in and over their lives, power and control that would not be available to them if they didn't own enslaved people. And in this way, slavery was their freedom. What did you learn about how these women treated their slaves? The institution of slavery necessitated a culture of violence, and white women and girls were a part of this culture. In order to sustain the institution and to keep enslaved people in a state of near submission, violence and the threat of violence were vital. This culture of violence also created opportunities for some people to indulge their propensity towards sadism, and women were not immune to this. Women perpetuated acts of extreme violence against enslaved people for the same reasons that white men did. One woman kept the enslaved people she owned in a state of near starvation and would tempt a young enslaved girl who cleaned her bedroom by leaving a piece of candy on her dresser each day. One day, the enslaved girl yielded to temptation and ate the candy. When the slave-owning woman discovered the candy missing, she accused the young girl of stealing it and proceeded to punish her by placing her head on the floor underneath the curved portion of her rocking chair. This woman then summoned her young daughter to help her punish the enslaved girl. While she rocked back and forth on the young enslaved girl's head, her daughter whipped her. When they finished punishing the enslaved girl, she was irreparably disfigured. She was never able to eat solid food again because her jaw would constantly slide to one side of her face. When she reached adulthood, her teeth never grew on that side either. Each time she was in her mistress's presence, her mistress was daily reminded of her cruelty, and it became so overwhelming that her mistress gave her to a relative so she wouldn't have to look at her anymore. You also explore how slave-holding mothers raised their daughters from a young age to manage slaves. Tell us about this. Children learn vicariously by watching their parents and other white adults in their communities interact with enslaved people, and some parents even allow young white girls to manage and discipline enslaved people themselves. Because slavery necessitated a culture of violence and it required constant reinforcement, white girls were constantly immersed in this culture. Even more than this, they played critical roles in it too. They learned about the power and authority as white people, and they also came to understand their roles in sustaining the institution of slavery. Ultimately, they came to learn that while they might endure oppression because of their gender, they possessed extraordinary power as white people, and they embraced this power. How did your research findings impact you emotionally? American history is too often viewed through masculine stories. The story of our founding and the story of American slavery are far too often masculine ones. As a descendant of enslaved people, this was a hard book to write. I've lived with this project for 10 years, and that has been 10 years of pain intermingled with pride. I've dealt with the pain of telling the story by taking time away from the book, but I always return to the work because I remembered that the enslaved people whose story I tell in this book often braved dangerous and potentially fatal circumstances in order to have documented what had happened to them. When they gave these interviews, they lived in a nation plagued by racial violence. When African Americans were lynched for not using the right salutations when addressing a white person, or moving out of the way when a white person approached them on the street, the interviewers were primarily white Southerners, and some of them were the descendants of slave owners. Formerly enslaved people knew this, and they knew the risk of telling these white interviewers about the most intimate dimensions of their lives, about the brutality they endured, and they told them anyway. In spite of the trauma, I owed it to them to persevere. And I ask those readers who find this book a hard read to remember this, to be brave, and to reckon with the history that appears on the pages. Why hasn't the truth about slave-holding women been better known in history? A few factors could be at play. The first studies focusing on women in slavery were written and published when women's history emerged as a field of study, and the field was formed at the height of the women's liberation movement. The story of white slave-owning women is a very ugly one that doesn't align with a primarily white feminist narrative in which white women find common cause with women of color and forge alliances based on shared gender oppression. Additionally, many women's historians studied women who left documents behind and thus focused on women who were literate and often elite. And by doing so, they offered studies of a very small subset of an already small group of women. The women in my book could be counted among the majority of slave-owning women, rather than the minority. Because many of these women were not literate or elite, historians often missed them. But using the interviews conducted with the formerly enslaved people they once owned, I was able to tell their story. And lastly, I think we hold out hope that women represent the better half of humanity. We hope that women will save us. This book dashes those hopes. And so I also like to add to that in my readings of some of Mama Ida B. Wells's writings, she talks about how back then many of the relationships between black men and white women were consensual. Right? So you have black men talking all this mess about, oh, well, we couldn't, even look at white women or we would be lynched or killed. Well, back then that wasn't stopping them. Because in her writing, she talks about how many times when a black man was lynched for a relationship with a white woman, the charge against him was not rape. And many of those lynchings, there was never a charge of rape against these black men. But these black men knew about this. They knew that entering into these consensual relationships with white women could lead to their, not just their death, but excruciating, painful deaths. Because many times these men were castrated alive before they were lynched. Sometimes there was a combination of being lynched and burned alive, but that didn't stop them from entering into these relationships with these white women. In one of my videos, I talked about a boxer by the name of Jack Johnson. He was married to 3 white women. And so what you have is you have this narrative coming from these 2 particular groups, and both of them are pointing the fingers at both black women and white men as the problem. And this is why you see all of these stories and attacks of black women, especially coming from black men. You got all this chatter, right, coming from the black men who, when they first talk, they sound like they're speaking in defense of blackness and being black. But what it boils down to is just a hatred of black women. Because we are seeing people like the comedian Godfrey coming out and making these statements about interracial relationships between black women and white men, and saying that they should instead be showing black men and white women. And so I knew this day was coming to where he was going to turn into the stereotypical black woman hating black male. You could just see it in him. But we are having these conversations about interracial relationships. But the last time I checked, according to Black Femicide, over 500 black women have been killed thus far this year. If I'm not mistaken, now somebody correct me if I'm wrong, it might have gone up. So that means we are slated to have over 1,000 black women. That's not including the children. The lives of over 1,000 black women be snuffed out just this year. And most of that is at the hands of black men. Most of that is at the hands of black men. And for all of these black people who are so concerned about what's going on in the community, I would think the lives of black women, the fact that black women are losing their lives, would be more important than an ad on a billboard showing some random black woman and some random white man, and or black women wearing bonnets and pajamas at the airport. Like, of all the black women that I've seen the pictures of and the images of and the videos of who have been killed at the hands of black men, I haven't seen a bonnet or a pair of pajamas in sight. So, many of these women are young, they're beautiful, they look like they like fashion, they have their hair done, the nails and the makeup and all of this stuff, just beautiful and gorgeous. Some of them are in their 20s, but they own businesses or they're in college and they have a bright, promising future. But instead, we're talking about bonnets and pajamas. It sounds silly. It just sounds so silly. Young women are losing young women who are the ones who defy the stereotypes. Many of these women are in college. They own businesses at a young age. They have their whole lives to look forward to. They're doing something in life. They're going somewhere. But people won't stand up for them. People won't speak out for them. People won't talk about these issues. You have these black women and black children who are being slaughtered in these communities. Could you imagine the kind of impact that it would have if some of these famous people who are throwing out all these jabs at black women for superficial garbage, if they would actually take this on and this went viral, the conversation about the things that are causing black women to lose their lives? Because you can't give back to your community. You can't build a community. You can't do anything if you're dead. Being dead is the end game. That's it. And I can't take what someone is saying seriously if they're talking about superficial bullshit when it comes to black women. Bonnets and pajamas at the airport when they standing next to a white woman wearing, pajamas, and, mark my word, you're going to see, if you see black women out there doing it, eventually you're going to see white women wearing bonnets to the airport or to the grocery store, whatever. That's just the way it works. Okay. So, that to me is just something that's very superficial. You got people out here losing their life. You got babies out here being gang sexually assaulted by grown men. This is not a fluke. It's not a one-off. This is a system that these males have created just for the purposes of doing this, targeting little black girls, targeting them to have this be done to them. And this is not viral in the black community. This is not viral, not even among black women. This isn't viral among black women. This kind of stuff is not viral among black women. That's a problem. That's a problem. It looks silly for grown women to be having a conversation about something so frivolous. When we get ourselves together as black women to where we're not being targeted because everyone views us as prey, then we can have the conversation about, okay, sis, you don't have all this pressure. You're not having to work 2 and 3 jobs to take care of your kids by yourself. So now it ain't no excuse. Now we got to get you together to where you're not walking outside the house with these bonnets and pajamas on. Right? Which this is not a widespread problem. I live in the South and I don't see it every day. I don't see it. It's rare that I see a black woman with a bonnet on outside her home. It's rare. Before this, everyone was having a conversation about how, women who dress up are high maintenance. They expect too much. Their standards are too high. So this seems like just another excuse to throw jabs at black women. It doesn't seem like it's anything really rooted in care and concern, because on one hand you have people saying that black women who get dressed up and dress nice and put on all the makeup and they're high maintenance and they spending too much money on hair and makeup and this isn't important and you can be investing that and this, that, and the third. It just seems like another excuse to throw jabs at black women. It doesn't seem like anything rooted in anything that's going to improve the lives of black women. And goodness knows that I have been a fan of Monique ever since I even knew there was a Monique. And I'm still a fan of Monique, and I will continue to be a fan of Monique. And I will say this. I have never seen Monique look busted. She always looks put together and gorgeous. But now, having said that, when she was having the issues with her career, she was not wearing a bonnet. They still treated her like she was a stereotypical, problematic, full of attitude, hard to work with black woman. They treated her the same. They didn't treat her any better because she was, looked flawless and gorgeous and had her hair done, not a hair out of place. Every time I've seen Monique, she looks gorgeous. Even when she was overweight, she always looked put together and gorgeous. I've never seen her in a bonnet or, some pajamas walking out the house or, caught by one of the paparazzis. I've never seen that. So that goes to show you right there that they're not treating you like that because you're wearing a bonnet. They're treating you like that because they view you as prey. And they view you as prey because black women focus on superficial stuff instead of focusing on the things that will improve our condition as a group. And what will improve our condition as a group is to work together as a group and to stop all the cattiness and the infighting and the finger pointing and the tea spilling and the finger snapping. Once black women start focusing on things that are important, that's when how you are treated will change. Okay. All right, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. I will be so happy to have you. You guys have a great day, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks.